The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Windsor Castle as Lieutenant James Morrison stood at his post near the main entrance. He had served as a royal guard for 15 years, watching countless dignitaries and members of the royal family pass through these ancient gates. His training had taught him to observe everything while appearing to see nothing, a skill that would prove invaluable on this particular autumn day. Camilla, the queen consort, emerged from the castle's grand entrance at precisely 10:45 a.m., her entourage trailing behind her like a well-choreographed dance. She wore a deep emerald coat that rustled softly with each step, and her expression carried the practiced composure of someone accustomed to public scrutiny. Morrison noticed something different about her demeanor that morning. There was a tension in her shoulders, a slight hurriedness to her gait that seemed out of character, as protocol demanded. Morrison remained statue-still at his post, his eyes tracking the royal party's movement toward the waiting Bentley. The Queen Consort's personal assistant, Margaret Thornberry, struggled with several leather bags, their weight causing her to lean awkwardly to one side. Morrison had seen Margaret handle the Queen Consort's belongings countless times before, but never had she appeared so burdened. The first sign of trouble came when one of the bags slipped from Margaret's grasp. It hit the ground with an unexpectedly heavy thud, the sound echoing off the castle walls. Morrison watched as Camilla's head snapped around, her face momentarily betraying alarm before she quickly composed herself. She whispered something sharp to Margaret, who scrambled to retrieve the fallen bag with trembling hands. Morrison's training kicked in. Something was amiss. The weight of those bags, the Queen Consort's reaction, Margaret's obvious distress. These details painted a picture that didn't align with a routine royal departure. He had been taught to trust his instincts, and every fiber of his being told him this situation required intervention. As the party approached the vehicle, Morrison made a decision that would change the course of his career and potentially alter royal history. He stepped forward from his post, breaking the cardinal rule of remaining stationary unless directly threatened. His movement was subtle but deliberate, positioning himself between the royal party and their waiting car.
"Your Majesty,"
Morrison said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to do. "I must request a routine security check before your departure." The Queen Consort's eyes met his, and in that brief moment, Morrison saw something he had never witnessed in all his years of service fear. It flashed across her features like lightning before being replaced by indignation. "Lieutenant Morrison," she said, her voice carrying the weight of authority, "this is highly irregular. We have a scheduled appointment that cannot be delayed." Morrison felt the weight of centuries of tradition pressing down upon him. Royal guards did not question members of the royal family. They certainly did not impede their movement. Yet something compelled him to stand his ground. "I apologize for the inconvenience, Your Majesty," Morrison replied, maintaining his professional composure. "However, given recent security concerns, I must insist on following updated protocols." The truth was, there were no updated protocols. Morrison was operating purely on instinct, a dangerous gambit that could end his career if his suspicions proved unfounded. He noticed Margaret's hands shaking more violently now, clutching the bags as if they contained the crown jewels themselves. Camilla's jaw tightened. "Lieutenant, I shall be filing a formal complaint about this unnecessary delay." "Stand aside immediately." But Morrison had noticed something else too, of the Queen Consort's security detail exchanging worried glances. They too had observed something unusual, though they lacked the authority, or perhaps the courage, to act upon it. Their subtle body language gave Morrison the validation he needed to persist. "And with all due respect, the safety of the royal family is my paramount concern." "A brief inspection will take only moments," Morrison said, his tone respectful but firm. The standoff lasted several seconds, though it felt like hours to Morrison. Palace staff had begun to gather at windows, drawn by the unusual scene unfolding in the courtyard. The Queen Consort's face had taken on a pink hue, whether from anger or anxiety. Morrison couldn't determine. Finally, with a sharp exhale, Camilla nodded curtly. "Very well, Lieutenant, but be quick about it. And rest assured, your superiors will hear of this impertinence." Morrison approached Margaret, who looked as though she might faint at any moment. Ma'am, if you could please place the bags on the ground for inspection. Margaret's eyes darted to Camilla, seeking guidance. The queen consort gave an almost imperceptible nod, and Margaret slowly, reluctantly, lowered the bags to the cobblestones. The way she placed them down with excessive care despite their apparent weight only heightened Morrison's suspicions. As Morrison knelt beside the first bag, he noticed the leather was of exceptional quality, with gold-plated clasps that bore the royal cipher. These were not ordinary travel bags, but custom-made pieces designed for the royal household. He reached for the first clasp, his fingers steady despite the gravity of the moment. Lieutenant Morrison, Camilla's voice cut through the tense silence. I must remind you that these bags contain personal items of a sensitive nature. Your discretion is not merely expected, but required by law. Morrison paused, meeting her gaze. Of course, Your Majesty. You have my word as an officer of the Royal Guard. As his fingers worked the clasp, Morrison couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to uncover something that would send shockwaves through the monarchy. The metal clicked open with a sound that seemed to reverberate through the courtyard. He lifted the leather flap, peered inside, felt his breath catch in his throat. The bag's contents were carefully wrapped in burgundy velvet, but even through the fabric, Morrison could make out shapes that should not have been there. His mind raced through possibilities, each more troubling than the last. He reached for the velvet, aware that every eye in the courtyard was fixed upon him as he pulled back the fabric. The morning sun caught what lay beneath, sending prismatic patterns dancing across the cobblestones. Morrison found himself staring at items that had been reported missing from the royal collection. Just 3 days prior, a set of Fabergé eggs that had belonged to Queen Victoria, their surfaces encrusted with diamonds and pearls that sparkled like captured starlight. Morrison's hand trembled slightly as he rewrapped the precious objects. His mind struggled to process what he was seeing. These were not merely valuable antiques. They were priceless artifacts of British history, items that should have been secured in the castle's vault, not tucked away in travel bags like common merchandise. He moved to the second bag, his movements now more urgent. This one was heavier, and as he opened it, he discovered why. Inside were rolled canvases, their edges visible beneath protective covering. Even without fully unrolling them, Morrison recognized the distinctive brushwork visible at the corners. These were the missing Turners. Paintings that had supposedly been sent for restoration but had mysteriously vanished from the conservator's workshop. The silence in the courtyard was deafening. Morrison could feel the weight of history pressing down upon him as he carefully examined each item. With each revelation, the picture became clearer and more disturbing. This was not a case of misplaced items or administrative error. The Queen Consort was attempting to remove priceless artifacts from the royal collection. Morrison stood slowly, his mind racing through protocols and procedures. There was no precedent for this situation. There was no guideline for what to do when a member of the royal family was caught with stolen treasures. He turned to face Camilla, whose complexion had gone from pink to ashen. Morrison began, his voice remarkably steady given the circumstances. I must ask you to return to the castle while this matter is investigated further. The Queen Consort drew herself up to her full height, her breeding and training evident in her posture despite the compromising situation. Lieutenant Morrison, there has clearly been a misunderstanding. These items are being transported for legitimate purposes. Then I'm certain the documentation will confirm that, ma'am, Morrison replied. In the meantime, protocol requires that these items be returned to secure storage pending verification. Margaret had begun to sob quietly, her shoulders shaking as the magnitude of their discovered deed sank in. 2 senior guards had approached, drawn by the commotion, their faces masks of professional neutrality despite the extraordinary scene before them. Camilla's voice, when she spoke again, had lost its commanding edge. Lieutenant, perhaps we could discuss this privately. There are circumstances you don't understand, pressing matters that required unconventional solutions. Morrison felt a pang of sympathy despite himself. Whatever had driven the Queen Consort to this desperate act, it was clear she had not undertaken it lightly. The weight of her decision was etched in every line of her face, aging her years in mere moments. I'm afraid that's not possible, Your Majesty, Morrison said gently. Captain Pemberton must be informed immediately. as must the palace security chief. As if summoned by his name, Captain Pemberton appeared at the castle entrance, his measured stride quickening as he took in the scene. Morrison had served under Pemberton for a decade and had never seen the man's composure crack. Today was different. As Pemberton's eyes moved from Morrison to the open bags to the Queen Consort's stricken face, his expression shifted from confusion to understanding to something approaching horror. "Morrison," Pemberton said as he approached, his voice carefully controlled. "Report." Morrison straightened, falling back on military precision to navigate the unprecedented situation. "Sir, during a routine security check, I discovered items from the royal collection in Her Majesty's luggage. The items appear to match those reported missing earlier this week." Pemberton's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He approached the bags, examining their contents with practiced efficiency. When he straightened, his face was grave. "Your Majesty," he said, bowing slightly, "I must request that you accompany me inside. We'll need to conduct a full inventory and investigation." Camilla nodded, her dignity intact despite the circumstances. "Of course, Captain. I trust this matter will be handled with appropriate discretion." As the party began to move back toward the castle, Morrison caught Pemberton's eye. His superior gave him the slightest of nods, acknowledgement of a job well done under impossible circumstances. But Morrison felt no satisfaction, only a deep sadness at what he had uncovered. The bags were carefully collected by security personnel, their contents catalogued with painstaking precision. Morrison watched as the Queen Consort was escorted back into the castle, her regal bearing maintained despite the weight of impending scandal. The oak-paneled conference room, deep within Windsor Castle, had witnessed countless historic meetings, but none quite like this. Lieutenant Morrison sat at the far end of the table, still in his ceremonial uniform, though he felt anything but ceremonial. Across from him sat Captain Pemberton, the palace security chief Sir Reginald Ashworth, and two representatives from the Metropolitan Police's Royal Protection Unit. 3 hours had passed since the discovery in the courtyard, and the castle was in lockdown. Staff members whispered in corridors, speculation running wild despite strict instructions to maintain silence. Morrison had provided his initial report, but now came the harder questions. "Lieutenant Morrison," Sir Reginald began, his weathered face grave, "you acted without direct authority, breaking established protocol. Before we proceed, I need to understand what prompted such unprecedented action." Morrison straightened in his chair. "Sir, I observed several anomalies. The weight of the bags, the Queen Consort's unusual demeanor, Miss Thornberry's visible distress. My instincts, honed through 15 years of service, indicated a security concern that required immediate action." "Instincts," Sir Reginald repeated, his tone neutral. "You risked your career on instincts." "With respect, sir, we're trained to observe and protect. Sometimes that means making difficult decisions in the moment," Morrison replied. Captain Pemberton intervened. "Morrison has an exemplary record. No disciplinary actions, commendations for vigilance. If he felt compelled to act, I trust his judgment." The door opened, and a senior aide entered, approaching Sir Reginald with a folder. The security chief's expression darkened as he reviewed its contents. "Gentlemen, the initial inventory is complete. 23 items from the royal collection were found in those bags, with a combined estimated value exceeding £40 million. Morrison felt the weight of the revelation settle over them like a shroud. This was no impulsive act, but a carefully planned operation. "There's more," Sir Reginald continued. "Security footage from the past week shows Miss Thornberry making multiple trips to various storage areas within the castle. She had clearance, of course, as the Queen Consort's personal assistant. No one questioned her activities." Detective Chief Inspector William Hartley from the Met leaned forward. "We'll need to interview Miss Thornberry immediately. Has she said anything?" "She's with medical staff," Pemberton replied. "Suffered a panic attack after the discovery. The palace physician sedated her, but she should be coherent within the hour." Morrison remembered Margaret's terrified expression, the way her hands had shaken. "Sir, if I may, Miss Thornberry appeared to be under considerable duress. Her behavior suggested someone acting against their will rather than a willing accomplice." DCI Hartley made a note. Coercion is a possibility. We'll explore. But first we need to understand the why. The queen consort has access to considerable wealth. Why risk everything for items she could never publicly display or sell? Sir Reginald stood, pacing to the window that overlooked the castle's inner courtyard. That's what troubles me most. This isn't simple greed. There's something else at play here. A knock interrupted their deliberations. A junior officer entered, his face flushed with urgency. Sirs, the queen consort is requesting to make a statement. She's in the blue drawing room with her solicitor. The men exchanged glances. Legal representation had arrived quickly, suggesting Camilla had anticipated this possibility. They filed out of the conference room, Morrison bringing up the rear, uncertain if his presence would be required or even welcomed. The blue drawing room lived up to its name. With azure silk wallpaper and priceless Sevres porcelain adorning every surface, Camilla sat in a high-backed chair. Her solicitor, a sharp-featured man, Morrison, recognized as Sir Charles Pembroke, one of London's most formidable legal minds, at her side. "Gentlemen," Camilla began, her voice steady but lacking its usual authority, "I wish to make a statement that will explain my actions, though I fear not excuse them." Sir Charles placed a cautioning hand on her arm, but she shook her head slightly. "No, Charles, they deserve the truth." She took a breath, her eyes focusing on a point somewhere beyond them. 6 months ago, I received a package. No return address, no identifying marks. Inside were photographs and documents that, if made public, would destroy not just my reputation, but that of the entire royal family. Morrison felt the atmosphere in the room shift. This was taking an unexpected turn. The material, Camilla continued, dated back decades. Some involved my late former husband, others concerned individuals still very much alive and in positions of power. The sender made their demands clear: certain items from the royal collection in exchange for their silence. "Blackmail," DCI Hartley said quietly. Camilla nodded. "I was given a list, specific items that could be removed without immediate notice. Things in storage, pieces not currently on display. I was told where to leave them and when. The first exchange went smoothly. They kept their word, returning some of the compromising material." "The first exchange?" Sir Reginald's voice was sharp. "How many times has this happened?" "Twice before today," Camilla admitted. "Smaller items. A Victorian snuff box, a minor constable sketch. Things that wouldn't be missed for months, possibly years." Morrison's mind reeled. The queen consort had been systematically looting the royal collection under duress. The implications were staggering. "Your Majesty," Pemberton said carefully, "why didn't you come to us? We could have helped, investigated discreetly." Camilla's composure cracked slightly, because the photographs included evidence of a cover-up at the highest levels of palace security. Documents with signatures I recognized. I didn't know who to trust. Sir Reginald's face had gone pale. "Are you suggesting corruption within our ranks?" "I'm suggesting," Camilla said carefully, "that whoever orchestrated this had inside knowledge and possibly inside help. They knew exactly which items to request, when they would be most vulnerable, and how to avoid detection." Sir Charles intervened. "My client was placed in an impossible position. The material threatened would have caused irreparable damage to the monarchy at a particularly delicate time. She acted to protect the institution, albeit through regrettable means." DCI Hartley was already on his phone, speaking quietly but urgently. Morrison caught fragments: full investigation, internal review, highest priority. "Ma'am," Morrison found himself speaking, drawing surprised looks. "The person making these demands, did they give any indication of their identity? Any clues at all?" Camilla's eyes found his, and he saw gratitude there. The packages were always left at predetermined locations. Dead drops, I believe they're called. But there was one thing: the typing on the demands had an unusual characteristic. The letter E was slightly elevated, as if from an old typewriter with a damaged key. It was a small detail, but Morrison filed it away. In his experience, small details often proved crucial. "We'll need everything," DCI Hartley said. "All correspondence, The compromising materials you still have? Details of the previous exchanges. And Ms. Thornberry? What was her involvement? Margaret knew nothing until this morning, Camilla said firmly. I told her we were moving items for conservation, gave her forged paperwork. The poor woman believed she was following legitimate orders. A commotion in the corridor drew their attention. Through the open door, Morrison glimpsed Margaret Thornberry being escorted past, supported between two palace staff members. Her face was tear-stained, her usual composure shattered. Your Majesty, sir, Reginald said formally. I must inform you that you're under palace arrest pending a full investigation. You'll be confined to your apartments with restricted communication privileges. Camilla accepted this with a nod. I expected as much. May I make one request? The material I've been protecting, it involves innocent people who would be devastated by its release. Whatever happens to me, please ensure their privacy is protected. As the Queen Consort was escorted from the room, Morrison felt the weight of what he had uncovered. This was no simple theft, but a conspiracy that reached into the heart of the monarchy. Captain Pemberton approached him. Morrison, you're to report directly to the investigation team. Your actions today may have exposed something far more serious than stolen artifacts. Over the following days, the investigation intensified. Morrison found himself at the center of the storm, providing testimony, reviewing security footage, helping piece together the timeline of the blackmail scheme. The palace was in crisis mode, with senior officials working around the clock to contain the potential scandal. Margaret Thornberry's interview proved illuminating. Still shaken but cooperative, she revealed details about unusual requests from the Queen Consort over recent months. Late-night visits to storage areas, requests for keys to rooms Margaret had never accessed before, and strange meetings with individuals Margaret didn't recognize. She seemed so troubled, Margaret told the investigators, Morrison present as an observer. I thought perhaps it was the pressure of her position, the constant scrutiny. I never imagined. The investigation team worked methodically, tracking the movement of the previously stolen items through security footage and access logs. What emerged was a sophisticated operation that had exploited weaknesses in the palace's security protocols. Meanwhile, forensic experts examined the blackmail materials Camilla had surrendered. The photographs were genuine, showing various royal figures in compromising situations spanning several decades. Some were merely embarrassing, others potentially criminal. The documents were equally damaging, suggesting cover-ups, financial improprieties, and abuse of power. This is a treasure trove for a blackmailer, DCI Hartley told the assembled team. Whoever compiled this had access to highly classified materials, possibly collected over many years. The typewriter detail Camilla had mentioned proved significant. Experts identified it as consistent with a specific model of Olympia typewriter. It's manufactured between 1962 and 1968. It was a thin lead, but it was something. As the investigation progressed, a pattern emerged. The requested items weren't random. They were all connected to specific periods in royal history. Items that had personal significance to various family members. It suggested the blackmailer had intimate knowledge of the royal family's private affairs. Morrison spent long hours in the castle, assisting where he could. His keen eye for detail, the same instinct that had prompted him to stop Camilla, proved valuable. He noticed connections others missed. Patterns in the security logs that suggested the blackmailer had been planning this for years. One evening, as Morrison reviewed footage from the castle's east wing, he noticed something odd. A figure in a staff uniform appeared in restricted areas at unusual hours. Always when senior security personnel were occupied elsewhere. The face was obscured, but the gait was distinctive, a slight favor of the left leg, as if from an old injury. Captain Morrison called Pemberton over. I think I've found something. They watched the footage together, Pemberton's expression growing grimmer with each viewing. That's someone who knows our protocols, our blind spots. This is definitely an inside job. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Among the blackmail documents was a memo dated 15 years earlier, discussing security arrangements for a state visit. The memo bore the initials RH and referenced information that only someone in the highest levels of palace security would know. Sir Reginald pulled personnel files going back to decades, looking for anyone with those initials who had left palace employment under questionable circumstances. They found their match, Robert Henley, former deputy security chief, who had resigned suddenly in 2010 citing personal reasons. "I remember Henley," Pemberton said. "Brilliant but ambitious. There were rumors he'd been passed over for promotion one too many times. Left bitter, they said." Further investigation revealed Henley had suffered financial difficulties after leaving palace employment. His security consultancy had failed, leaving him with substantial debts. More importantly, medical records showed he'd suffered a leg injury in a car accident. 5 years ago, consistent with the gait Morrison had observed in the security footage, the net was closing. Metropolitan Police surveillance teams were dispatched too. Henley's last known address, while investigators delved deeper into his background, what they found was a man with motive, means, and opportunity, the perfect storm for the elaborate blackmail scheme. Morrison continued his duties, but the castle felt different now. The discovery had shaken the very foundations of the institution he'd sworn to protect. Staff members went about their tasks with subdued efficiency, aware that one of their own had potentially orchestrated this betrayal. The Queen Consort remained confined to her apartments, her meals delivered under guard. Morrison occasionally glimpsed her through windows during his patrols, a solitary figure, reading in her sitting room or walking in her private garden. Whatever her faults, she had been as much a victim as a perpetrator. 3 weeks after the initial discovery, the investigation team assembled for a crucial briefing. DCI Hartley stood before a board covered with photographs, timelines, and evidence markers. "Robert Henley was arrested this morning at a cottage in Devon," he announced. "We found typewriters matching the one used for the blackmail notes, as well as copies of all the compromising materials. He's not talking yet, but the evidence is overwhelming." Relief washed through the room, but it was tempered by the magnitude of what they'd uncovered. Henley's betrayal ran deep. He had spent years after his resignation cultivating sources, gathering intelligence, and planning his revenge against the institution he felt had wronged him. "There's one more thing," Hartley continued. "We found evidence suggesting Henley wasn't working alone. Someone inside the palace was feeding him information, helping him avoid detection. We're still investigating, but several junior staff members are under scrutiny." Morrison felt a chill. The conspiracy was even broader than they'd imagined. Trust, once broken, would be difficult to rebuild. As the meeting concluded, Pemberton pulled Morrison aside. "You'll be receiving a commendation for your actions. What you did took courage, challenging a member of the royal family based on instinct alone." "I was just doing my duty, sir," Morrison replied. "No," Pemberton said firmly. "You went above and beyond. Your instincts were right, and your actions prevented what could have been a catastrophic loss to our national heritage." The morning of the closed tribunal arrived with unseasonable fog blanketing Windsor Castle. Lieutenant Morrison adjusted his dress uniform for the 3rd time, the weight of the occasion pressing upon him. 6 months had passed since that fateful day in the courtyard, and today, justice would finally be served, though not in the way anyone had anticipated. Morrison entered the castle's ancient justice chamber, a room rarely used in modern times, but chosen for its symbolic significance and absolute privacy. The oak-paneled walls seemed to absorb sound, creating an atmosphere of solemnity that suited the unprecedented proceedings it's about to unfold. Already assembled were the key figures who had shaped this extraordinary case. Sir Reginald Ashworth sat at the head of the table, flanked by representatives from the Crown Prosecution Service, the Metropolitan Police, and surprisingly, 2 members of Parliament's Intelligence and Security Committee. The presence of the latter suggested this case had implications far beyond simple theft and blackmail. Robert Henley sat in the defendant's position, looking older than his 62 years. Prison had not been kind to him. Gone was the confident bearing of a former palace security official, placed by a hollow-eyed man who seemed to have aged a decade and 6 months. His solicitor, a young woman with sharp eyes, sat beside him reviewing notes, but it was the presence of Camilla, seated with quiet dignity despite her circumstances, that gave the proceedings their surreal quality. She wore a simple gray suit devoid of her usual jewelry, her face composed but weary. The months of house arrest had taken their toll. Sir Reginald called the tribunal to order. We convene today not in a court of law but in a chamber of truth. The unique circumstances of this case require discretion and wisdom beyond what public proceedings could provide. All testimony given here is sealed under the Official Secrets Act. Morrison was called first, asked to recount once more the events of that October morning. He spoke clearly, professionally, aware that his words were being recorded for posterity. When he finished, Henley's solicitor rose. "Lieutenant Morrison," she began, "you acted on what you call instinct. Had you been wrong, you would have committed an unforgivable breach of protocol against a member of the royal family. What made you so certain?" Morrison had pondered this question many times. 15 years of observation, ma'am. You learn to read people, to sense when something is amiss. The Queen Consort's behavior was inconsistent with every other departure I'd witnessed. Combined with Miss Thornberry's distress and the unusual weight of the bags, I felt the risk of inaction outweighed the risk of causing offense. The solicitor pressed further, but Morrison's testimony held firm. He was dismissed with thanks from Sir Reginald. Though he remained in the chamber as an observer, privilege granted in recognition of his crucial role, Margaret Thornberry testified next. Her voice barely above a whisper as she recounted her unwitting participation. "Her Majesty told me we were protecting the royal legacy," she said, tears flowing freely. "I thought we were preventing items from being sold off due to budget constraints. I never questioned. I should have questioned." The prosecution treated her gently, recognizing her as a victim of deception rather than a willing accomplice. Her testimony painted a picture of Camilla under extreme pressure, acting increasingly erratic in the weeks leading up to the discovery. Then came the testimony that would shift the entire narrative. Detective Chief Inspector Hartley took the witness position. A thick folder before him. "During our investigation," he began, "we discovered that Robert Henley's collection of compromising materials was far more extensive than initially believed. The photographs and documents used to blackmail Her Majesty were merely the tip of the iceberg." He opened the folder, though its contents remained shielded from general view. Mr. Henley had amassed evidence of misconduct spanning 50 years, involving not just the royal family, but members of government, judiciary, and law enforcement. Some of this material appears to have been gathered officially during his tenure at the palace, retained illegally after his resignation. The implications were staggering. Henley hadn't just targeted Camilla. She was simply the most vulnerable, the newest member of the royal family with the least institutional protection. Furthermore, Hartley continued, "We've uncovered evidence that Mr. Henley was planning to expand his operation. Documents found at his residence detailed plans to approach other victims, including senior politicians and business leaders with connections to the palace." For the first time, Henley showed emotion, his jaw tightening as his carefully constructed scheme was laid bare. His solicitor requested permission to confer with her client, but Sir Reginald denied it. "Mr. Henley will have his opportunity to speak shortly." The session broke for lunch, though few had any appetite. Morrison found himself in the corridor with Captain Pemberton, both men processing what they'd heard. "This is bigger than we imagined," Pemberton said quietly. Henley was building a private intelligence network, using palace secrets as currency. When proceedings resumed, it was Henley's turn to testify. He rose slowly, his leg injury more pronounced under stress. When he spoke, his voice carried a bitterness that years hadn't diminished. "I gave 25 years to the palace," he began. "I revolutionized security protocols, prevented 3 credible threats against the royal family. And what did I receive? Passed over for promotion because I didn't have the right school tie, the right connections." His solicitor tried to redirect him to the facts of the case, but Henley was beyond such considerations. They protect their own, cover up their indiscretions while destroying anyone who threatens their perfect image. The materials I collected, every piece was evidence of hypocrisy, of one rule for them and another for the rest of us. "So you decided to become judge and jury?" Sir Reginald asked coldly. "I decided to balance the scales," Henley replied. "The Queen Consort was perfect, new to the family, desperate to fit in, carrying her own secrets. She would have paid indefinitely to protect the institution she'd married into, and the items you demanded. Henley's smile was bitter. Poetic justice. They hoarded treasures while ordinary people struggled. I simply liberated a few pieces, planned to sell them to collectors who would appreciate them. The money was secondary. It was about making them feel vulnerable, making them understand what it's like to have your life controlled by others. His testimony continued for 2 hours, a mixture of genuine grievance and delusional self-justification. He revealed his inside source, a junior archivist named Timothy Westbrook, who had been caught embezzling funds and whom Henley had blackmailed into cooperation. He detailed his methods, his future plans, and his complete lack of remorse. When Camilla took the witness position, the chamber fell absolutely silent. She had maintained her dignity throughout the ordeal, but now, faced with the man who had tormented her, her composure wavered. "Mr. Henley," she began. Addressing him directly, "You speak of justice and balance, but what you did was cruel beyond measure. You didn't just threaten me, you threatened innocent people whose only crime was trusting the wrong person decades ago." She turned to the tribunal. "I take full responsibility for my actions. I chose to protect reputations over protecting the law, but I ask you to consider the impossible position I was placed in. The materials Mr. Henley possessed would have destroyed lives, ended careers, and potentially destabilized the government at a critical time." Her testimony revealed the full extent of her dilemma. The photographs included evidence of a former prime minister's affair with a foreign intelligence asset, a senior judge's involvement in covering up a scandal, and financial improprieties that reached into the current cabinet. The ramifications of disclosure would have been catastrophic. "I attempted to find another solution," Camilla continued. "I consulted discreet inquiries, tried to identify Mr. Henley through handwriting analysis, even considered confiding in my husband. But each path led to greater risk of exposure. In the end, I chose what I believed was the least damaging option." The Crown prosecutor rose. "Your Majesty, you had a duty to report criminal blackmail regardless of the consequences. Your position doesn't exempt you from the law." Camilla agreed quietly. "It doesn't. I failed in my duty, both to the law and to the institution I swore to serve. I accept whatever consequences this tribunal deems appropriate." As the testimony phase concluded, Sir Reginald called for a recess. The tribunal members would deliberate in private, considering not just the crimes committed, but their unprecedented nature and the complex web of victims and perpetrators. Morrison used the break to walk the castle grounds, needing air after the intensity of the chamber. He found himself at the spot where he'd made his fateful intervention. The cobblestones now just ordinary stone rather than the stage for a historic confrontation. "Second thoughts?" a voice asked. Morrison turned to find DCI Hartley approaching. "None," Morrison replied. "Though I wonder sometimes what would have happened if I'd stayed silent." "Henley would have continued his scheme, possibly for years," Hartley said. "Your instincts didn't just recover stolen artifacts. They exposed a cancer that needed cutting out."